Well, hello, and thank you for joining this World Council of Credit Unions virtual event, Crafting an Effective Board Agenda for Directors and CEOs with Miranda Fleury. My name is Greg Newman, Director of Communications for World Council. Before we get started this morning, we just want you to please take a moment to click on the interpretation button on the bottom of the screen and choose your preferred language, English, Portuguese, or Spanish, to make sure you can hear this meeting in that preferred language. Again, it's on the bottom of your screen. Tómese un momento para hacer clic en interpretación y elija su idioma, inglés, portugués o español, para asegurarse de que puede escuchar esta reunión en su idioma preferido. Reserve un momento para clicar en interpretación y escoger su idioma, inglés, portugués o español, para ter certeza de que você pode ouvir esta reunião no seu idioma preferido. Apologize for the poor Spanish and Portuguese. This event will include breakout sessions where you can discuss some of today's themes with one another. And we are happy to have a diverse audience online with us. And to make sure we can make this meeting as accessible to everyone as possible, we're going to need you to give us some help in order to put you into those breakout sessions. If you would like to be in a breakout session with other Portuguese or Spanish speakers, please rename yourself in Zoom now and add PT or ES before your name. Again, to give our interpreters time to explain, if you'd like to be in a breakout session with other Portuguese or Spanish speakers, please rename yourself in Zoom now as demonstrated on the screen. Add PT for Portuguese or ES for Spanish before your name to make sure you're in the right breakout room. If you have trouble renaming yourself, please put a comment in the chat with which language you are requesting, and we can help rename you. And we also ask today that you turn your cameras on so we can see you and Miranda can interact with you. Now, once again, Miranda Fleury, President of Hawkeye Strategies in Canada, is going to help you today articulate the value of a well-designed board agenda. If you have any questions for Miranda, hold on to them until the end of the webinar. We can ask those questions of her at the end of the presentation as time allows. Miranda, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Greg. I am so excited to be here with you today. And everybody, I can see good morning for a number of you, good afternoon, and good evening for a number of you as well. I can see that we're here from all over the world, which is pretty amazing. Here to talk about crafting an effective board agenda. And so when Waku actually challenged me to present this material to you in 60 minutes or less, and so for those of you who know me very well, you know that I love to talk and that I love to engage the audience as much as possible. So the challenge was given to me, which means I'm predominantly actually going to be speaking about things that you can actually do today to make a difference on making your board agenda that much more effective. We're not going to get into any of the theory or things like that. We're actually into the practical application of making your board agenda that much more effective. So if you do have any questions for me as we do go through the material, we do have a live question and answer period at the end of our session. And of course, you are more than welcome to reach out to me through any of the channels that are made available, whether that's through my email, contact me through my cell phone, or even connecting with me on LinkedIn, and you'll see that coming up. So for those of you who do not know me, my name is Miranda Fleury, and I own Hawkeye Strategies, which is based in Canada, but I have helped credit unions all over the world, and I have an amazing team that works with me, and I have helped small credit unions and very large credit unions as well in the 3 different areas that you see on the screen here through facilitating and consulting work. So supporting with things like strategic planning, enterprise risk management support, CEO succession planning, so on and so forth. You name it, my team has probably done it. We also support with director and executive education, and an example, of course. And then, of course, actually looking at speaking engagements, and I have the pleasure of speaking to presentations. I'm just going to mute somebody here. There we go. So with that, I'm actually just going to jump right into our topics for discussion. So our first topic here will be talking about the value of a well-designed board agenda. So this is going to be talking about our why. So why are you actually spending time with me today to talk about how to actually craft a board agenda that's more effective than what it is you're doing today? So we'll talk about the why, but the bulk of what it is we're going to be talking about is how do you actually make your board agenda more effective? And so I have actually collected a... There we go. I have actually collected quite a bit of research on this item, but I have also had the pleasure of chatting with a number of my credit union clients, specifically the board chairs and CEOs, about what they thought actually made their board agenda effective. And then as well, I also happen to sit on one of the most complicated and largest cooperatives in North America, and I've been able to take some best practices. So that's where all of that information comes from when we get to that piece. And then lastly, of course, as you heard Greg talk about, we will have an opportunity to jump into a short breakout session towards the end here, where you'll get to learn from best practices from other directors and executives around the world through some interaction. So with that, let's get to the value of a well-designed board agenda, and let's actually talk about the why. And of course, there are many other reasons besides the three that I have here, but I thought these were the three most important reasons why it would be worthwhile to think about how you craft your board agenda. And the first piece here is setting the tone. So thinking about as a director, as you're going into the meeting, your board agenda actually sets the tone in terms of, is this going to be a really taxing and a really heavy meeting? Is it going to be a meeting that allows you to be innovative and creative, things like your strategy sessions? Is it going to be a meeting that's going to have contentious items that you need to prepare for accordingly? Or is it simply going to be one of those routine meetings? But setting the tone actually dictates how your directors are going to show up to the meeting, and that's a very, very helpful piece and indicative in terms of the dynamic that you're going to have around the board table, and that actually comes from your board agenda itself. Your board agenda also enables directors and executives to prepare accordingly, and I mean beyond just simply actually reading your board packages. It actually allows directors to think about, do I need to conduct some type of extra prep work in order to be prepared for this session? Do I need to reach out to my board chair or perhaps even my mentor on the board to get more information around a particular topic? And it also, quite frankly, gives clarity and purpose as to what you're going to be talking about and what decision points you have at the board meeting. And then lastly on the slide, which is a very important piece, is helping directors to fulfill their fiduciary responsibility. And so whether you're at a board level or you're at a committee level, that agenda really becomes that guide for making sure that directors are spending enough time in their oversight role, an area, of course, that your regulators will be quite keen over, and then as well your strategic level oversight and the components that go in that piece as well. So that is your why behind the value of a well-designed board agenda. But why should you bother switching up the routine? I mean, oftentimes I hear, we've had our agenda for years. There's no sense in switching it up at this point. And I'd like to actually read for you a quote that I thought was very fitting to answer this question. So, but the default design that board meetings are used primarily as in-person updates has been stagnant for years. Management teams spend hundreds of hours preparing for board meetings each year, and board members spend dozens of hours enduring them. But our blind devotion to the routine of these meetings, how you prepare for them, how they're experienced, what they actually accomplish, causes leadership teams to waste a huge amount of time and to miss a huge opportunity to leverage board members' experience and perspectives in a much more creative and collaborative way. And so this is a reason why you should actually think about, should I change up the way in which our board agenda is laid out today? And what I often find with my credit union clients is that board meetings tend to run out of time for crucial strategic conversations simply because they're just misdesigned to begin with. So I do want to jump into the bulk of our presentation today, which is how to make a board agenda more effective. I have actually broken this out into 3 different sections. So we're going to spend time talking about number 1 here, systematic processes, then number 2, how you can prepare as a director, and number 3, we'll talk about the board chair and CEO, the relationship and facilitation. But specifically, we're going to speak to systematic processes, what you're actually going to do in advance of distributing that board agenda and your board package out to your directors. Now, this is going to be both in terms of the prep work that you need to do, but also the actual agenda items that you should consider. I'm going to warn you here, this is the largest section in the presentation. There are a number of ideas. I think I actually have just under 30 different ideas. They're separate ideas altogether. I am literally going to spitfire them at you. But by no means are you supposed to go and take every single idea that I have said here and go and change up your board package based on that. If you can take 1 to 3 ideas that I have presented here and take that back to your board for discussion and consideration about changing your board agenda, that would be a win for today. So don't think you have to take all 30 ideas. Take a few of them, take what you think would apply, and we can go from there. All right, so I can see a number of you who are on my screen here. I'm just going to look down. Are you ready to get started? Does that sound exciting? Yeah, you can see a few of you are smiling. Okay, we'll get right into it then. So let's talk about some systematic processes. So starting off, you can actually ask the question, what's the best use of our time together as a board? And ideally, you should be asking this question probably on an annual basis, especially as you have new director turnover. It actually helps to set with board norms, what are some expectations around the board table, but also helps to collect feedback, especially from newer board members who can actually contribute to what they think is the best time should be spent with the board. The reality is your board agenda should be flexible and should change based on the different dynamics that you have. So for example, if you have 50% turnover on your board, the reality is you're probably going to be spending a little bit more time on board development and board education than you normally would. Okay, your next idea is to add objectives to the board package itself or to each section or each header within your board package. And by adding these objectives, it actually helps you to think about what are you actually trying to accomplish besides the resolution that you have written within your board package. But what are you trying to accomplish? And is there an element that goes beyond just the simple oversight role of a director? Is there a strategic element that's attached to it? You can also consider switching your headers in your board package to questions. And so what I mean by this, as an example, is a typical header that I will see in a board package is CEO succession. You could actually consider switching that to where are we in fact vulnerable from a leadership turnover perspective, and how might we actually address these vulnerabilities? So you can probably hear the difference of CEO succession versus when I phrase it in that question really helps you to think about what are you trying to accomplish with that particular section in your board package. Now, the next one is a bit more of a controversial item that I have on the slide here, and I'll speak to why I think it's a bit controversial, is you might want to consider adding times or a % beside each header to indicate the weight of the discussion topic. Now, I know personally, I wouldn't do this if I was in a facilitation because I like to keep the fluidity and flexibility. But I did have one of my clients recommend, and they do sit on a larger cooperative board, recommend that they do actually have timings and or weights in their agendas to indicate where, for the directors, we should be spending more of our time in conversation, having in-depth discussions, but that by no means does not stop a director from asking questions and going in depth on topics that perhaps have a little less time. So that's just an idea that you've got there. So the next idea, and this one is an important one specifically to me, just because I've seen it here so many times, is you might want to consider placing strategic or contentious items first on the agenda. And there's actual science behind moving these items up to the first half of your section in your agenda, because you will spend more time on the first half of your agenda than you will on the latter half. There's literal science behind it in any meeting, but of course in board meetings, you can just observe that yourself. And so by being able to move that up, it signifies the importance of that strategic item or that contentious item and allows people to use all of their brain power while they're fresh to be able to engage in discussion and dialogue and speak to it with a fresh mind there. You can also consider assigning board members to specific elements of the board agenda to actually leverage their talent. So perhaps you've asked, Director A to speak to a particular item based on their experience. It helps to foster engagement and go forward that way. You might also ask board members to become mentors on the board and to actually help newer directors go through the board agenda and better understand it. And these items help to make your board agenda that much more effective. One of my favorite ones, of course, is adding humor where you can, personal connection, images, and music. And you know what? You might be sitting there thinking, Miranda, this is a little bit fluffy for my liking. But the reality is you're actually able to encourage creativity and innovation by adding these elements to it. And it actually helps to cement items into memory when you can add that personal connection, humor, images, or music. And I know when I have built board packages in the past, I have deliberately added some coy lines into the board agenda or into the board package itself, just to add a little bit of levity. I don't know the number of you on the call, how many of you have had board packages that are over 200 pages long, but I have had those before, and it can get a little bit monotonous. And so it is nice to add a little bit of humor or images, music, and that personal connection where you can. Now, this next one might be a little bit obvious, but maybe a little bit harder to execute, is making sure that you have built-in breaks based on the flow of discussion. So not necessarily that you have to break at 10 in the morning, absolutely, but recognizing and being able to read the room when it's appropriate to take breaks, to give people some time to get their thoughts together, step away from having the in-depth conversations that they're having, and to come back a little bit more refreshed. I would also encourage you to think about, how do you make it easy for a director to review your package? Now, for those of you that have board agendas and packages that are electronic, but are not necessarily in some type of governance software, whether that's Diligent, whether that's Aprio, I would actually encourage you to think about, can I add hyperlinks to the bottom of every single page in my board package that hyperlinks right back to the agenda? So it's easy to click back and forth, and making sure that your agenda is in fact hyperlinked as well, so people can jump back and forth between the different sections. If you already are using that governance software, it is likely already built in, and making sure that the software that you are using is intuitive and easy to follow. For those of you that are having your board packages that are on paper, it's as simple as making sure that you have page numbers and people can easily reference where they need to go. But sitting in the shoes of a director, and particularly a new director, make it easy for them to navigate the information so that their time and their cognitive load is actually spent focusing on the board package itself instead of trying to fight back and forth with the agenda. So in terms of our next section here is actually scheduling a separate meeting as needed. And so do not be afraid that if you have a more contentious item that we've got on the agenda, or something that you think requires a lot more discussion, is to schedule an off-cycle meeting. And so I have seen this done with things like CEO evaluations. I have seen it done with recruitment for CEO, conversations like mergers and acquisitions, where you've actually just separated them out from the board package to give them the time that they deserve and the focus that they deserve. Don't feel the need to actually cram everything into your board package itself. And of course, lastly on this slide is asking for feedback and constantly iterating. And so you can do that at the end of every board meeting through a concept called real-time feedback, where you're actually asking 3 questions at the end of every meeting. What went well? What would you change? And is there any additional feedback that you'd like to be able to provide? And you can ask your entire board and as well the executive team who's participating in that. But also you can add a question on your annual board evaluation to speak about the board agenda specifically to be able to get feedback. Okay, we do have people who are quite keen here that I can see are annotating on my slides. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to see if I can erase that. There we go. It's a good thing I know Zoom real well. All right, you can challenge me all you want as you go through this presentation. Okay, our next section that we have here is still talking about systematic processes, and the next idea is actually sharing your board agenda in advance, which for some of you, okay, like this is very basic, but in other cases, it's not necessarily. Ideally, your board agenda and the entire package should be shared within 5 to 7 days of your board meeting. And there's a reason for this. Number one, you need to give management enough time to compile the information and give it to you. And number two, that information, you actually want it to be as timely as possible, but you need to give directors enough time to prepare for that information and digest. So ideally 5 to 7 days. So I'm actually going to come to Katie, who's going to bring up our first poll here. And you will see on the slide, you can select whichever item applies to you. We do have it translated in Spanish as well. And I have been told that those of you who speak Portuguese have the ability to read this in Spanish quite easily. So the question is, how many days in advance do you receive your full board package? I'm not talking about when does your board agenda come out with a couple of different sections in your board package. I am talking about the full package itself. So how many days in advance do you receive it? Is it 7 days in it or greater than 7 days? Is it between 5 to 7 days, which is the ideal and recommended? Is it between 2 to 4 days? Is it 1 day in advance of the board meeting? Is it the same day as the board meeting? Or are you unsure of the question, or perhaps it's not applicable to you? So I see we have got, let's just see, we've got 61% of you have voted. We'll give you a few more moments here. Let you think about that. Okay. Oh, we're at 70%. Okay, perfect. Katie, all right, you can stop the poll and you can actually launch the results that we've got here. And so there you go. So we've got actually 41% of us said you're within that ideal range. And then we've got a number of you who are actually getting your board agendas 2 to 4 days in advance. I would suggest that if you are sitting in the section below 5 to 7 days, that you probably are going back and having a conversation with your board chair to indicate the need to have that board agenda pulled up a little bit further so that people can appropriately prepare for that. Okay, so perfect. We're going to stop sharing that poll. Thank you, Katie, for doing that. And we're going to take that poll down. If it doesn't come off your screen, just simply exit out and it will go off your screen there. Okay, our next section that we have, next idea, is this concept is taken as read. And so one of my spicier clients actually coined this term, so I can't actually take credit for this term here, but a really helpful tool when you're crafting the agenda is to assume that people have actually read the entire agenda and the entire board package, and that the agenda actually only deals with more information or presentations that's not actually already part of the package. And this really allows you to spend more time for questions and answers instead of actually reviewing the material that people have actually already read. Now, this is very easy for me to say in theory and much harder in practice. I have found that there are examples where information is presented in a board package, and it is actually helpful to talk about that information, particularly on the financial side. It is helpful to have conversations around that. But there are so many instances where I have sat through board meetings and it's absolute torture when somebody is actually reading their reports. So whether it's a committee report, whether it's a CEO report, it feels like torture because I've already prepared for it. I already have my highlights ready to go. I already have my questions, but I have to sit there and endure it. And so for those of you who also feel like me, what I would encourage you to do, if this resonates quite well with you, is to take this back to your next board meeting and to talk about how can we apply this concept as taken as read while still being able to get the information across that we need to. So I love that term, taken as read. So by all means, you can go ahead and start using that. You might also want to consider the frequency and the duration of your meetings. Now, what's really interesting, working with a number of different sizes of credit unions, is the smaller the credit union, the greater the frequency of board meetings. I actually see that smaller credit unions tend to meet on a monthly basis, and larger credit unions tend to meet on a quarterly basis. And there are a number of reasons why I could postulate why this happens. But the reality is, it's more important for you to think about, is the number of meetings that we're having appropriate for what it is we're trying to accomplish, and just simply going and reflecting on that. You might also want to consider the duration of your meetings as well. So I know when I go in to facilitate something like a strategic planning session, as an example, I try not to go any more than 7 hours in a day. And those sessions are much more interactive than a board meeting will be. And so what I would suggest based on that is, ideally your board meetings probably not going anywhere between or over 5 to 6 hours long, especially for those of you that have quarterly meetings, as opposed to those shorter meetings. I have actually heard of board meetings going until 1 in the morning, which I think is absolutely preposterous. And I'm not sure how effective you are at 1 in the morning. So just thinking about the duration that you have of some of your board meetings there. Now, one of the pieces on the board that I currently sit on, I have added this here that I found super helpful, is actually adding your proposed resolutions to your board agenda itself. So if you have a section where you know a resolution is coming up, if I'm actually just looking at your agenda itself, I should be able to see every single resolution, every decision that I need to make is right there on the agenda, so that I can go and dive into that section a little bit more and flip back to understand what resolution or motion is being proposed, what decision is being asked of me as a director to consider. That has been a really helpful one that we use on the board that I currently sit on, that I would recommend that you add if you don't already have it within your board agenda. Consider building an annual board calendar to guide your agenda. So for those of you who don't have this already, it's thinking about what you would call a calendar of activities and breaking out, whether it's by month or whether it's by quarter, what are you trying to accomplish in each month? So whether that's, in Q1, you're thinking about preparing for your AGM. In Q2, you might be going into your strategic planning area. Q3, you might be talking about enterprise risk management, and maybe Q4, you're looking at approving a budget and approving that strategic plan. And those are some of the examples that would go into a board calendar, but the reality is that calendar can then actually feed into your board agenda at every time you have a board meeting to help you better fulfill that fiduciary responsibility that you do have. This next one is a really important one as well, and that's providing a platform for directors, issues, topics, and themes. You need to absolutely give directors time to talk about the items that they want to talk about. And that does not mean that that happens right then and there at a specific board meeting, right after a specific question or a comment that's been made. But it does mean that you do have a follow-up component later on if the topic is in fact appropriate. If directors do not have the platform that they need in order to articulate their thoughts and express their opinions, let me tell you, they're probably going to continue to do it, and it's going to be in a less constructive manner. So you might have factions that start to build within your board, where people are getting together outside of board meetings and they're talking about items that make them uncomfortable. And they might be bringing that right back to the next board meeting to try and bombard a board meeting or change the board agenda to address those particular topics. So it is simply easier for you to state that a topic that has been brought up as a theme is going to be discussed either at the next board meeting, maybe it's discussed at the next strategic planning session, but not to just simply ignore it. So if you step back for a moment and you think about what are the topics that actually come up around your board table on a frequent basis that aren't necessarily on the agenda and are not necessarily addressed. I am sure you can probably think of one or two that comes to mind. These are the items that you want to address at a following meeting where it's appropriate to do so. You also might want to consider the location of your board meetings. There is something so incredibly powerful about actually changing the environment in which you are sitting. And for those of you who have ever heard me speak about this, I always say that in a typical board meeting, you show up, you sit right next to the exact same person that you've always sat beside, you have the exact same conversations, and it doesn't breed creativity or innovation. And so the act of actually moving to a separate room, a different room, maybe it's a different location, different city altogether, which you often see in strategic planning sessions, is actually quite helpful to change people's mindsets and makes your board agenda that much more powerful. You also, if you are the board chair or committee chair on this call, you need to be prepared to pivot in real time. And that does not mean that you are constantly deviating from your agenda, but you need to be able to recognize when it is important to pivot in real time to be able to address some of the items that are coming up. I do want to jump into, we're still under systematic processes. I warned you this was a longer section, but I want to actually speak to actual agenda items that you can add. So consider incorporating that CEO update. So most of you likely on this call have a CEO report that is fed into your board agenda, or maybe it's a verbal update from your CEO, but you might want to think about what keeps our CEO up at night. And this really helps to identify risks that your CEO is considering over the last month, over the last quarter, and also to identify potential opportunities and how it actually interplays with your strategy itself. You might also want to consider adding an agenda item of the board chair debrief. Now, for those of you that sit in larger credit unions on the board, the reality is your board chair probably has a greater level of interaction with the CEO and or the executive team. And it is great to hear if there's any information that they feel that the board should know about and should pass on that isn't necessarily warranted of a different agenda item besides that update. You might also want to consider building in strategic checkpoints to frame or encourage discussion. And this is just my fancy way of saying build in questions into your board agenda to get directors thinking about elements of the board package beyond their own opinions and their own questions. And you might do this for a number of reasons. You might do this to encourage strategic level dialogue if you find you're diving into operations itself. But you also might do this if there are sections in your board agenda where directors simply are shy or don't necessarily speak to the topic itself. And I typically see this under your financial statements. And so it's great to add in specific questions to help elicit discussion. You will get a copy of my slides. I do have a number of questions that are on 2 different slides that you can actually take away. And so feel free to go ahead and take those. I'm not going to go through and read these questions here for you, but WACU will actually send out a copy of these slides as well as a handout for you to reference, and you can go back and look at these. And so one more slide here on actual agenda items. Your next piece here at the top is creating efficiencies with the consent agenda. And so, and as well, color-coded dashboards. Now, remember how I said I did research and I asked a number of my credit union clients, what's really important to make your agenda effective? The consent agenda piece was the #1 item that people had said. So for those of you who do not know or do not use a consent agenda at this time, your consent agenda is an area on the agenda that allows you to take your routine items or some of the reports that don't necessarily require discussion, but are required from a transparency or a regulatory point of view. It allows you to group it all underneath the consent agenda and then to apply a resolution to everything within that area to say that you've approved or you've received your consent agenda. It's meant to speed up and create efficiencies. It does not stop you from being able to pull items out of your consent agenda and to have discussions on them. But the idea is to create efficiency so that you can spend more time talking about items that allow you to be in the present moment or in the future of the credit union itself. You might also want to consider color-coded dashboards. And these items are very helpful if you want directors to take in information faster and to focus on specific areas. So whether these dashboards are from your enterprise risk management updates, your strategic plan updates, or maybe even your financials. It just helps to take in information and make your board agenda that much more effective. You might want to consider adding in a strategic discussion section, which is framed very carefully. And I mean this beyond your simple update that's coming from your strategic plan itself. And so maybe the board chair actually frames a question that's around strategy that allows for a bit more of a free flow dialogue. Maybe you have this section is rooted based on the context of your current strategy as well. You'll probably want to set an objective around this section, and you want to make sure that management is very engaged so that they don't become overwhelmed with some of the discussions that are happening, but it's a great way to encourage strategic level dialogue. You might also want to consider adding a board development section. I've actually worked with a board where at the beginning of every board meeting, they add 15 minutes to their board package for a bite-sized board development piece, whether that's on governance or it's an aspect of the business, and it just helps to root people in that continuous learning mindset. But there are other examples of board developments where you can collaborate with other credit unions, maybe on a quarterly or every 6-month basis. As long as you're incorporating that board development piece, that's quite helpful. Now, the last point that you see on this slide here is arguably one of the most important points out of any of the ones that I have suggested today, and I have saved it for the end of this section here, which is having board in-camera meetings before your board meeting starts, having a board in-camera session with your CEO at the very end of your board meeting, and then actually ending the entire board meeting with another board in-camera section. So 3 in-camera sections. For those of you who are not familiar with the terminology in-camera, that just simply means a private meeting that's held with the board only and whomever they choose to invite. These should be standing agenda items on your board package itself. And by no means should these items start with the question, does anybody need to go in camera? So you should automatically have these in-camera sessions built in. When you have it at the beginning of the meeting, that allows for directors to have more discussion around the board agenda, what's coming up, any anxieties before you go into the meeting. When you have it afterwards with your CEO, it allows your CEO to be able to share information in a transparent way without the rest of the executive team present, because there might be items that they want to share with you that they cannot share in front of their executive team. And then of course, closing it off at the end with a board only in-camera session to be able to reflect on the meeting itself and provide feedback and input. So I'm going to come to Katie here one more time for our second poll to come up, because I am very curious about how many of you have these standing. What we've got here on the poll is we're calling it private sessions, just because in camera would translate well, but we do mean in camera for those of you that are speaking English. So do you have standing in camera sessions built into your board package? And if yes, how many? So no, you don't. Yes, we do, but we don't always actually do it. And then we've got, yes, we've got one in-camera session or one in private session, or yes, we have more than one, or I'm not actually sure. So I'm going to give you another 30 seconds on that. Okay, I have 60% of you who have voted already. Oh, we're getting faster at this. All right, okay. Keep going. We're almost at 70. Okay, Katie, we will close that poll and launch the results. I'm actually a little bit surprised. So everybody should be able to see on the screen here, 53% of you said no, we do not have a private or an in-camera session built into our agenda. So for the 53% of you that just said this, I would strongly encourage that you consider adding at least one in-camera session, probably at the end of your board package, but best practice would be adding it at the beginning, adding it at the end with your CEO, and then having a final one there. So just thinking about those pieces. Okay, thank you, Katie. We'll get you to stop sharing those results. And everybody else, you can pull down the poll off of your screen by clicking X if it has not come off your screen yet. Okay, I am going to go into the next section. I did warn you that was the longest section. Section number 2 and section number 3 here are much shorter. And so let's talk about director preparation. What is it you need to do when you actually receive your board agenda and your board package? And so these are some questions as a director that you can think about when you receive your next board package. What are you trying to achieve beyond this meeting that goes beyond oversight? What are you trying to achieve at this meeting itself? Now, if you have objectives built into your board agenda, that's an easy read. But if you don't have objectives built in, think about what you're trying to achieve beyond simply the resolutions themselves. You might want to ask yourself if you want to propose any changes or any additions to your agenda itself. And please, please, please be respectful enough to tell your board chair in advance if you would like to propose changes or additions to your agenda. Sending a quick email in advance is much more helpful than throwing your board chair or your committee chair on the spot. You might want to think about, how does your agenda align with your current strategy, and how does it help to talk about that strategy? You'll also want to think about what resolutions are actually proposed. So ideally, if they're in your board agenda, it's easy enough to be able to reflect on. But oftentimes, I actually don't even see resolutions anywhere even within your board package there. It's just something that's verbal that happens. So it is helpful to think about what resolutions are going to be proposed or what's actually proposed in your board package. A few more questions here. Is what additional information might you actually need to feel comfortable making decisions? And so if you're thinking about a section that has a resolution attached to it, is there additional information that you need to be able to effectively vote on a motion? What items might actually be contentious on your board package? And what's the role you're going to play in those conversations? How are you going to show up to those conversations? What's your opinion on it? Have you tested your own assumptions? Have you thought about the blind spots if you're really rooted in a particular topic and in a particular opinion? And ultimately, where are you going to add value and where are you going to ask insightful questions? The reality is you have a number of directors that sit around the table because they bring different perspectives, different experiences. And so where can you leverage your own experience and your own perspective to add value and to ask insightful questions? Okay, I told you it was a short section. We're going to move on to section number 3, which is looking at the board chair and CEO and their relationship and talking about the facilitator. I think it's very obvious that the relationship between the board chair and the CEO is so important. And the reality is that there should be a large amount of input that is coming from your CEO and possibly your corporate secretary, if you're large enough to have a corporate secretary, that's feeding into your agenda. Ultimately, the board agenda is owned by the board, but these roles should absolutely be feeding into it for a number of different reasons. Number one, it fosters engagement amongst your management team, which is very, very important. But number two, they actually know these hot topics that need to be discussed, and they are probably keeping tabs on your board calendar and ensuring that items are in fact covered. I also want to speak to the importance of facilitation, and there's a really big difference of being a facilitator versus being involved in the discussion. And in most cases at board meetings, your facilitator is your board chair, or it happens to be your committee chair. But there are other times where you are asking other folks, whether it's committee chairs, management, or even a third party to come in to facilitate, to discuss and engage everybody effectively. But regardless of who it is so important that you're picking up on those subtle cues that people are starting to fidget, they're getting anxious, they no longer want to talk about a particular topic, and to actually move the agenda along. And especially around contentious items, it's really important to have a very, very strong board chair or an outside facilitator come in to help you with those items, to be able to have a really in-depth and robust conversation. And so with that, one of the pieces that I heard that was fantastic to hear is that these items and these ideas validated a number of the practices that were already happening to date, which is great. And being able to take one or two items back to think about to go and enhance, bring your board package up to the next level there. So with that, we are at the end of the session. We're going to jump into live Q&A. So live question and answer period, and I'm going to hand that over to Greg, who is going to moderate that for us. So Greg, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Miranda. Yeah, we only have a few minutes left, but if you do have a question, please put it in the chat because there are over 200 people here, and if we let everybody talk, they might be talking over each other. So please put your question in the chat if you have one for Miranda. We already have one from Kenrick Jarvis. Where does CEO reporting to the board relate to the private session? I think he needs an explainer on that one.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So you typically see a standard CEO report that goes into the entire board, which the entire executive team would also read as well. But what I was suggesting is you would have that, and then at the end of your board meeting, your executive team or your management team would leave, but the CEO would stay to provide either a verbal or another written update on items that they are unable to actually share in advance or with the executive team present. There are examples of potential layoffs that are coming, or a movement around of the senior management team that they have not actually shared with that group yet. And those are examples of items that you would see. So thank you for that question.
Got it. Alvin asks, and this may be an obvious one, but we don't want to assume that with any of these. Who is responsible for the board packet?
Yeah, so good question. So ultimately, and I'll repeat one of the pieces that I said here, your board owns the agenda itself. I have seen different practices in terms of who compiles the agenda. So it depends on how large your organization is. So whether that's the CEO that's actually compiling the information, whether it's the corporate secretary that's compiling it, admin that's supporting with it, but ultimately the ownership rests with the board itself. And then how that's compiled depends on the level of sophistication and resources that you have at your credit union. Good question.
Waiting for a few more, but I'm curious, people have been running board meetings at credit unions for decades, and there's still so many inefficiencies. I mean, when you talk to people, they're still asking these questions, and it's do you find that there are more people kind of still out in the woods looking for answers than there are who have figured it out? And maybe we saw that from some of our polls today.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the assumption behind that is there are a lot of board agendas tend to be very inefficient, and it comes from the mentality of we've always done it this way. And so people don't question it. People don't say, is there a better way to actually address our board agenda or improve it to make our meetings that much more effective? And so the act of that we have so many people who are on this call today implies that you're open to the idea of changing it and taking things back, which is a great first step.
We have another question. How do you ensure that these small board meetings do not become problematic and deteriorate corporate governance when you consider the exclusion of other members? Okay,
so I'm going to interpret this myself. So how do you ensure that these small board meetings do not become problematic and deteriorate corporate governance? So when you're thinking about excluding other members, I'm going to assume that has to go with the in-camera piece that I recommended. And so it is very much a best practice in corporate governance to deliberately have sections within your board agenda that do not include management or just simply include the CEO as well. It is not necessarily meant to as an exclusion piece. You need to think about it more from what are you trying to accomplish and what types of discussions need to be had in these private sessions. And I think when it comes to your point on how do you make them not problematic and deteriorate, that goes back to one of the suggestions that I made, which is having objectives for those sections to ensure that you're accomplishing what you need to accomplish.
We have gone over the hour, but if people want to hang on, and Miranda, if you have a minute, we have a few more questions coming in. So we have a question. Is it advisable to conduct an executive meeting? That means without a meeting without the CEO, and if yes, how often?
Yeah, and so it depends what you define as executive meeting. So I'm going to transfer this back to the board meeting itself. I would suggest at every single board meeting, you have time set aside without your CEO and without the management team to have conversations. This could literally look like a 5-minute dialogue where you're catching up and talking about the weather. And it could also look like you're having conversations that you're unable to have in front of your CEO for a variety of reasons. But the act of having that on a consistent basis allows the anxiety levels of your management team to go down quite a bit, instead of only having in camera or these private sessions with just when you have an issue. So every meeting, that's my answer.
And we have one more. What are some of the important reports that may be on a board agenda?
Ooh, that's a great question. So you typically have your consent agenda, which includes a number of the regulatory reporting. So whether that's the financial reports that need to go attached to it, whether that's looking at your concentration risk and having your top 10 members, you typically have committee reports that are attached to your board agenda. You have a CEO update. You typically have strategic planning updates. There are so many different reports that can be fed into an agenda on a consistent basis. And a lot of that depends on your credit union itself and the regulatory body that is actually overseeing your credit union as well. So there you go.
Miranda, thank you so much. I mean, I think you gave a lot of our attendees, over 200 from continents all around the world, a lot to think about and a lot to take back to their credit unions. So we really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and feel free to reach out to me anytime. Everybody will have the slides and a handout, and you will have my contact information if you'd like to follow up with me on anything.
All right. And once again, we want to remind people that today's webinar was recorded. So if you got a lot out of it and you want other people from your credit union or your board directors to get a lot out of it, it will be available later today on the World Council YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/woku. And if you like today's webinar and you want to participate in some awesome in-person learning and networking activities next year, I encourage you to visit the website wcuc.org. You can find out more about the 2023 World Credit Union Conference we will be hosting in Vancouver with the Canadian Credit Union Association. That's set for July 23rd through the 26th. Over 30 educational sessions will be held throughout that 4-day event. Conference attendees will hear from global industry experts on a variety of topics, and the extensive educational program includes 32 concurring breakout sessions, workshops, keynote sessions, as well as a solution center geared towards solving today's credit union challenges. Once again, we want to thank you for joining us. Have a great Tuesday, everyone.